What gets in the way of believing and surrendering to Jesus? Is it intellectual obstacles like science seeming to make faith obsolete? Is it moral misgivings like wondering how the world can be full of suffering if there's a good God in charge? Or is it just the gaggle of annoying and sometimes mean-spirited Christians giving Christianity a bad name? How does God answer or overcome all of those things to win an atheist over? Well, we're going to be talking about all of that and so much more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. Theology on Air, of course, is an offshoot of a Houston event ministry called Theology on Tap, where we invite young adults all over Houston to come together over craft beer and good food and interesting and sometimes controversial topics around theology, philosophy, faith and culture, all kinds of juicy things. And our next one coming up, I'm not sure when this airs, but I'll say it just in case. And if you miss it, then you can go back and watch it on YouTube. April 4th, we're going to be talking about hell with Chris Date, who's going to be flying down to talk to us about his thoughts and views on hell. And everybody has some, so come and join us for that. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the outreach director for young adults at MDPC out on the west side of town, joined as usual by Evan McClanahan, who's the senior pastor at First Lutheran in Midtown. And our guest today, I'm so excited, it's taken a long time to make this happen, is Mary Jo Sharp. Mary Jo is a former atheist who came to faith. She's been, I'm so sorry, I messed that up. I said it wrong. But either way, she's experienced two worlds of American culture, the post-Christian culture of the Pacific Northwest and the evangelical culture of the Bible Belt. Mary Jo is an assistant professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University and the founder and director of Confident Christianity Apologetics Ministry. She's been featured in Christianity Today's cover story, The Unexpected Defenders. Is that the one where you, like, all the women wore the cool dresses? And yeah. And she's an international speaker on apologetics, focusing on love and logic to uncover truth. And she lives with her husband and family now in Portland, Oregon. Welcome to the show.
Yeah. Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. I've known of you for a while. I've seen you on panels for apologetics stuff, but I heard you say in one of the early ones that you were an atheist who was won over and then sort of not, and then again. And so your story has always been intriguing to me. So before we get into all of the ins and outs of like your book and your answers to some of the tough questions, I would just love for you to tell our listeners about you, about your story, what kind of started to move the needle when it comes to questions of faith.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't grow up in the church. And in fact, my parents had left church when I was too young to remember. So and I grew up, like you introduced me, as a person from the Pacific Northwest. So up here, in the time that I was here growing up, religion was very private. And we didn't have churches on every street corner. And so it's this, we have an attitude of a little bit more of religious relativism. What's good for you is good for you, but, that's for you. So sort of keep it to yourself kind of situation. So I only say that not to denigrate people in the Northwest, but because when I moved to the Bible Belt, it was so different, culturally different. Everybody talked about church and having gone to church and their daddy was a pastor or an uncle or something. So it was really different to me. But I do bring that up to say that I didn't have like a Bible culture growing up. Like the environment I grew up in was sort of void of that. What I knew of Christianity, I got from TV and the movies. And so that's pretty shallow.
Sorry.
It's pretty shallow, like The Exorcist, stuff like that.
Oh my gosh.
So what I did have, though, what my parents gave to me was a very rich cultural upbringing in the arts and sciences. My dad was a chemical engineer who, I have to say this because you guys are Theology on Tap. We actually came out to Portland, Oregon because my dad was brought out here as assistant brewmaster for Henry Weinhard's Private Reserve. Ooh. So we came out to Portland because of the craft brew industry out here. So before it was cool, like in 1976.
Now, yeah.
Yeah. So, my dad was a lover of, cosmology, anything outer space, loved to watch Carl Sagan. Like if I was sitting down with him, we were watching a nature or science show, took us camping all over the Pacific Northwest and taught us this profound sense of wonder at the universe in which we lived. And so I believe that though my background wasn't steeped in Christianity, Through the arts, my dad was also a musician, and my parents took me to a lot of plays and musicals and jazz concerts and symphony orchestra. I began to wonder at what all this beauty is for. What is the, look at this vast universe. Who are we, and how do we gain meaning and purpose in this? And so I started to have those questions as I got older, as a teenager, and my mind could start to formalize those kinds of ideas. So at that time in my life, I was getting ready to be a music educator. I was going off to school to teach band. I was a band kid and I wanted to teach band. And I had this high school band director who was a Christian, who was really burdened for me to share his faith with me. But he was really worried that he could lose his job if he did so. So he struggled with it for a while, but then he came to the conclusion in my senior year that he had to witness to me.
Wow.
And he gave me, my senior year of high school, he gave me a Bible. And he said, when you go off to college, you're going to have hard questions. I hope you'll turn to this.
Wow.
And he prayed with me. I didn't remember that part. He had to remind me. And he told me that I did not have a super great reaction. He actually thought that I might turn him in. So I don't know what I said to him. I think he was just really nervous because, he was stepping out in faith. And I think he was worried about that. So that witnessing moment, he actually hit me at the, exact right time. And I respected him, obviously, because I went off to college and got an undergrad in music education. And I taught band for a while. And I started to read that Bible and then came to the conclusion that this made sense of my questions and in my sense of right and wrong. And it made sense of all this beauty I was seeing, that there was a designer behind it. So when I went off to college.
Wait, just real quick. You got all of that from reading the Bible?
In some ways. I wasn't not formalized in that sense.
Beginning
but yes,
steps.
Yeah,
okay.
The beginning, the baby steps.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be quite impressive. But then it impressed me enough that when I went off to college, I actually began to explore faith. So I'm sort of the opposite story of, the kid going off to college and losing their faith. So as I was exploring faith in college, I found one where they clearly explained the need for a savior and, mankind's situation. And this all made sense to me. And it was in one of those college churches that I accepted Jesus, trusted in him.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And that's where the story ends.
Yeah, absolutely. No.
So that happened, but then your life as a Christian after that things were sort of tenuous, right? And I mean, I don't know if I have the order right, but at some point a lady was mean to you. I know that's part of the story. There's like a public shaming moment.
Yeah. That's
talk about in the book.
Yeah. So that's at that first church where I became a believer. I was actually married at that point. I was a young college student. Young married college student, and found my husband right away. But
did you find him through music? Because I know he's a music guy.
Yeah, we both marched in the University of Oklahoma marching band.
It's so nerdy and adorable. I love it. Okay.
We're still nerdy and adorable.
That's actually true. Yeah.
So, my little nerdy musician from a small town in Oklahoma, he grew up Baptist. And so he and I went to this church that he was invited to. It was a Baptist church. And that first day, I had accepted Christ. The pastor had actually visited us at our apartment, and he had talked me through a prayer of salvation and then said, hey, you need to make this a public commitment. So that's terrifying to me as an Oregonian, because religion was very private to us. And I didn't grow up in this environment where everybody went to church and just talked about Jesus. So that to me was that's a big step, and it made me nervous. So I have two dresses because I'm a poor college student, and I picked one that I thought was good. My husband affirmed. And we show up at church the day that I'm going to walk the aisle. So if you know evangelical culture, you walk up the aisle of the church in front of everybody and tell them that you've accepted Jesus. And then everybody comes and greets you afterwards. This usually takes place at the end of a church service. So as we're walking into that service where I'm going to do that, the pastor's wife is standing outside the sanctuary, and she's greeting everybody, smiling, and she sees us coming, obviously knows that I've accepted Christ because her husband was the one that led me to the Lord. And she smiles, her smile drops when she sees me, and she looks me up and down and says, oh, honey, we need to get you better clothes.
Oh my gosh.
That's my first, like, so now I got, like, it's my first entry there into the church, and I've got to go up in front of the church wearing that dress and say, hey, everybody, in this horribly inappropriate dress, apparently, I have to now profess Christ. And it's just, I think that was the instigator for me, like a really early instigator that maybe these leaders can't be trusted, and I'm not sure that they're focused on the right things, and that sort of, put that seed of doubt in there.
Man, as soon as you said that, my mind started churning for like a really snarky comeback, which just shows my own attitude. That's really horrifying and awful. I'm so sorry. Does she know that's in the book?
She's dealing, honestly, and I can say this publicly now, she's dealing with a lot worse situation because the gentleman that led me to the Lord is in jail for pedophilia. So,
geez.
So there's
a twist I was not ready for. Wow.
Yeah. So there's, I think that's a bigger worry in her life than anything that I've written.
Yeah. I used to get little notes in our offering plate that said, this was maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And it was anonymous, but I know who it was, and they've left the church. But basically said that the women were wearing inappropriate attire, like because their shoulders were, or their like arms were showing, and basically they weren't wearing turtlenecks.
So, absolutely.
Yeah, and I didn't always probably disagree with that assessment, but I never
big fan of turtlenecks. Are you?
I am actually, but I never went up to any ladies and was like, hey, that's
my gosh,
inappropriate.
Thank goodness.
Yes.
Yeah. I've had, we're not to this part of the story yet, but anyway, I remember one time I did an event in Oklahoma City at a church where it was a musical, and it was beautiful. We were portraying the creation. So we were portraying John 1:1 in song and dance. And I had these girls in full body leotards with 2 layers of full length skirts over them. And they it was dark and you could barely see them, and they would spin open and unfold a candle. It was just beautiful because they were, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God.
Yeah, and the light.
And the light, So I thought, oh, this is gorgeous. And it got called slutty by my pastor.
Wow.
Because they were in leotards. Yeah. So the female human form, because we could see some general shape there, was slutty. So a woman of casual sexual partners. So that's the kind of stuff that is just too far. That's not about modesty.
But these stories point to what you've talked about a fair amount, which is that like people, not God, but people that sort of rep for his team can be really awful, and they affect our stories, and they affect the way we think, like the kind of the lens through which we think about faith. So
Absolutely.
So after that, was that kind of the beginning of you sort of going, oh, I don't know, maybe maybe I'm not about this life, or what was that like the next however many months after that?
Yeah. Well, a little bit before the slutty comment. It was a few years before that at a different church.
Oh, I was referring to the dress comment. I didn't know if that started to turn things for you.
Yeah, okay. It did. Absolutely. Because that was, I only used that instance because it's palatable. Like when I originally wrote my book, there were so many things I included that people just were angry. Like they were so angry. Like, well, that's not the point of the book. I don't want you just angry at these churches. So I had to pull out a lot of the stuff that happened. But as I saw more and more of these things, these patterns, not just instances, patterns of behaviors, of people walling up into self-righteousness, pride, lots of stuff that the Bible absolutely condemns and was totally acceptable within the church culture. I started to think, I don't know that these people actually believe the Bible. So they say that they do, they profess it, but I'm just not really seeing a commitment in their lives to, to Christ-likeness, to weed out these problematic behaviors, to apologize for them, to feel remorseful when they treat people really badly. And so I said, I think that they don't actually believe in God. I think this is more of a social club. And that was where I started to question. So I kind of had an emotional doubt at the start that caused me to look for reasons for why I believed. It turned into more of intellectual questioning.
Okay, interesting. So you never really lost your faith in God, but maybe in the church for a while. And then that forced you to kind of look at intellectual objections or intellectual reasons for God's existence, that kind of thing.
Well, I began to
Prove it to yourself again.
Yeah, I began to distrust that God was really there, that Jesus rose from the dead, because I had nothing to go on. So it's like, why am
I see.
Yeah. So I started thinking, I don't know what I've committed myself to. Is any of this even true? And so I began to pick it apart, sort of argument by argument.
Yeah. I had this question for much later in our conversation, but what you're describing there is hypocrisy, right?
Yes.
So I'm just curious how, and I've come across this a ton, even with people in my own family, like, well, why would I believe that? Because the church is just full of people that are hypocrites. Yeah. And then I say, no, the whole world is. But how do you now like address this when you're talking to a non-believer or just a world of people that think they see scandal in the church, they see hypocrisy? How do you handle that when you're talking to people and you know that God is still real, despite the fact that people can be real jerks?
Yeah. There's so many different ways I handle it. Like you did a general statement, which is like, yeah, hypocrisy is a human problem. It's not a religious person problem. It's actually a human problem. So all of us will say things, profess things, and then go back on those statements. And that makes us a hypocrite. But I typically, with somebody who, a lot of times if somebody brings that up, like, well, the church is full of hypocrites, if they're going to say something like that, they probably have an experience. So I'm going to agree with them up front and just say, yes, the church has failed to live up to the profession of goodness and truth and beauty that they proclaim constantly in the biblical truth. Like I hear the term biblical truth a lot, and yet even the people who are professing that, pick and choose which biblical truths to support and which ones they're going to allow to affect their lives. So I would just say, yeah, that happens in the church. But for me, and I tell them, this was one of my issues with the church, but I figured out that the behaviors and attitudes of Christians couldn't actually be the litmus test for the truth of Christianity, because that didn't make any sense. You could do that with atheism or Buddhism or anything else. It's just not the litmus test for it. So you actually have to find out if Christianity is true. And that's what I would tell them. That's the process that I went through. So the hypocrisy issue actually was it was a push to find out, well, what do you think is actually true about this?
Yeah. Okay. So when you're doing all this digging and you have doubts and you're doing some research, what were your biggest objections to faith? And of course, if you want to throw in at this point, what you think now would be like top 2 or 3 objections to faith. I'm curious about that too. Like, what do you think they are? We recently had, Ken Samples on the show, and he said it feels like, in another season of his ministry, the question was, does God exist? But now the question seems to just be, is he good? It's about God's goodness. Like, and I thought that was interesting because I do find more people talking, they don't really want to hear the cosmological argument. They're like, okay, maybe he's out there, but he seems kind of like a jerk, so I don't know if I really want to follow that kind of God. I don't know if it was like that for you. I'm curious.
Man, we need to teach the cosmological argument from the pulpit, guys.
I love it. Like, I'm a big fan.
But anyway, sorry. So for me, as I said, that what started my, my objections, my doubts was this idea of hypocrisy, which that is also a growing objection to belief in God, is the hypocrisy of the believers. So I know when we think about things theologically and philosophically, we're like, well, that's not actually an objection. This is more of a subjective viewpoint on, believers in the church. But it still is a growing objection. And I think I had that at the start, but that led me to say, I don't even know if God exists. So that would have been mine, is, does God exist? And the second one was, how do I even know Jesus rose from the dead? Like, I don't know. And I've got this text, the Bible, but I don't know where it came from, and I don't know who wrote it. So those were kind of my, the paths that the rabbit holes that I went down into.
Just those tiny things. Yeah. The resurrection.
So, but, I didn't originally, when I was coming into Christianity, the problem of evil, which I didn't know was that formalized statement, that would have been huge for me, because I was like, oh, God seems to explain good and evil in the world. This is the belief in God, this standard of goodness. That sort of picked up on the tail end of looking at my doubt, and was one of the things that kind of slammed me back around was, oh my goodness, I actually believe there is a way things should be. And I believe that everybody acts like this. We use ought language and should language. So there's some kind of standard we're referencing, whether or not we know what it is. So where do you get a standard like that? So the problem of evil is something that actually kind of brought me back around solidly to belief in God.
Yeah.
Objections today. Is God good? The problem of evil. I hear a lot of, I actually hear a lot of the hypocrisy objection. I hear a lot of the, it's arrogant to think that you have the only way objection, the truth. I get a lot of, I am spiritual and open to spiritual things, but I want nothing to do with the institutionalized church. And then that affects their view of God as well. And then I get the problem of evil is God good. I think I just said that. But yeah.
No, that's probably the one I hear the most still too. Were you going to say something?
Well, I mean, it is rational, I think, for people to witness Christians behaving badly, if you will. And, you know, it's not rational to hold against God per se. But it's certainly understandable. I mean, when you do look at like really horrible scandals like child abuse, you know, that's been covered up by the church systematically, or, you know, things of that nature, the outsider understands that Christianity, and maybe Hollywood is to blame for this, but it is supposed to be an all-encompassing change in the life of the believer. I mean, you know, we're supposed to like change how we think. We're supposed to repent of our sins. We're supposed to, I mean, the average person knows that's what's supposed to happen. So if it doesn't happen, I mean, it's not that many steps to say, well, then maybe they don't believe it. Like you were saying, like maybe these people aren't even Christian, you know? And honestly, there might be churches where that is a fair assessment. I mean, I that might be somewhat controversial, but you know,
I don't know if we can throw out the entire church, but I mean, that verse,
he said some.
I know. No, I meant for each church. Hopefully there's a few believers in the mix, but I
would think so. But
there's that verse, they'll know you're Christians by your love. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so if we don't seem that loving.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, that's that John, I'm glad that you brought that up, Evan, because absolutely. I don't mean to say you can't get there rationally from, you know, the viewpoint of seeing Christians, you know, not being kind to each other, especially. And that goes back to John 17, where Jesus is praying in the garden for how we will demonstrate, you know, our love for one another will demonstrate to the world that he's actually God's son. And there's as an apologist, you know, I could just give you arguments, but here's Jesus in the garden saying, my love, like the way that we love, is a huge demonstration to people. It's a huge testimony as to whether or not he's the Son of God, the very thing that we're using all these arguments to say, no, this is actually who he is. And we can't divorce that. You know, we can never divorce that. We can't just say, oh, here, I'm going to give you a bunch of arguments, but I'm going to act like a jerk. Here's the objective truth, but I'm not going to be objectively loving. I'm just going to trash them. And the reason, you know, you get John 17, which Francis Schaeffer refers to as the final apologetic. But then you also have 1 Corinthians 13, where you've got Paul saying, if you have all knowledge and you can speak in the tongues of angels, you know, and all these of men, but you don't have love. He says, even if you have faith to move mountains, but you don't have love, he says, you're nothing. That to me as an apologist says that I need to be very careful at how I'm presenting arguments and how I'm saying what I'm saying, not just do I have good arguments?
Yeah. And I think we should listen to when the unbeliever has an objection. Are they just kind of grabbing onto something they think will stick, or do they have an experience that would be worth exploring? You know, I visit a lot of churches when I like go on vacation. You know, we're out of town, so we'll go to a church, and it's usually not a Lutheran church. And I have to say, my experiences have almost always been entirely positive. I think, wow, these are salty there with people. They're very kind. I mean, maybe there's bad experiences to be had, but my point is that for all the stuff people see on TV about Christianity or in the media, the vast sort of under the tip of the iceberg is very positive and small communities of loving people and probably imperfect, but
probably.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm still thinking about the pastor's wife who said something about your dress and what a horrible thing that was to say. So those things, you know, could happen at any church, but I don't know. I think it's a fair, I mean, I had a student a while back, smart guy, nice guy. We talked for maybe 45 minutes. He was an unbeliever. And after a while I said, well, like, I mean, when was the last time you read the New Testament? And I mean, 25 years ago, you know, something like that. And hadn't been to a church in forever. And I was kind of like, well, I mean, dude, I mean, you don't even like, do you really want to engage with this at all? You know,
Yeah.
he was kind of your Carl Sagan type though, right? Like, hey, you know, all these universes and it couldn't possibly be true and people don't rise from the dead. And, but it was all kind of cliches, you know, he had never really dug in himself. So I was kind of disappointed in that.
That's actually when people make the pagan Christ, the Christ myth theory argument. That's kind of have you read those sources? Like when was the last time you actually read like Luke or Matthew and then compared it to the Egyptian Book of the Dead?
Yeah.
So you might want to do that before you make the claim that Horus is an exact copy of Jesus' story, because they don't come really that close. They come close on things philosophically that things come close on, like everybody's looking for salvation of mankind in some way or another. What's the afterlife? Do we have one? You know, people tend to practice rituals and things like, I mean, so there's, you know, like we all say prayers, not everybody, but there's a general, you know, throughout religions, we also, but when you get down to the nitty gritty, have you read the Bible lately and compared it so that you actually know what you're making a claim about?
So you're saying Zeitgeist is not a reliable source of information.
And yet they have millions and millions of hits, right?
Yeah.
So, right. Yeah.
You know, there's something about this conversation, though, that could, like, the backside of this conversation is actually encouraging for a lot of Christians who think that you have to have all the knowledge that Mary Jo Sharp has to be able to tell the, you know, hurting world about Christ. And the truth is that the first requirement is just to be kind. Right. And then use a little Greg Koukl, like, how did you come to that conclusion kind of stuff? And you're halfway there because that's what you just did. You're like, well, have you read the source? Like, how did you come to this conclusion? And if you're kind to people and you're showing them you're a Christian by your love, I don't know that you always have to know every apologetic, you know, syllogism to be able to kind of move the needle on that, which is good news for a lot of people.
No, and if you're kind to people, they're going to ask you questions about your faith. If you open up that conversation and give them a place where they feel confident that they won't, you know, we call it, I almost hate to use the term, but we call it safe space. When you create a safe space for people, they will open up. That's kind of what happens to me. And they will ask you things about your faith. Especially when they think you're genuinely interested in them and they're not just like a salvation project for you.
Yeah. Okay. So you brought up, and I realize that we are going to ask a lot of really hard questions within this hour podcast. So in as much as this is something you can tackle in a few sentences, you brought up the problem of evil, right? That there's suffering in the world, there's evil, there's ugliness, there's unkindness, there's pain. And I mean, this is something you've talked about a lot. You write about a lot. If there is a God who's loving and he's all powerful, how in the world is that stuff there? How does that work? Why does God let that happen? What is kind of your answer to that?
All right, let's just sum up a couple thousand years of philosophy. And
I believe in you.
2 minutes. Go. I do want to say
5. Okay.
I do want to say that though, because pretty much I want anybody listening to know that anything I offer you in like 2 minutes is so unsatisfactory. I'm teaching a full course on this at the university right now, The Problem of Evil, and it's 8 weeks, and 8 weeks will be unsatisfactory. And they're going to read really hard works like Leibniz and Rowe and Mackey and Plantinga. So I do want to say that I can offer some ideas about it, but you really need to dig into it yourself and think, for yourself about why you believe, even why do you believe your argument's valid about look at all this evil? Because for one thing, in a world, let's say we take God out of it, there's no, like Richard Dawkins likes to say, there's no good or evil at the base of the universe. We're all just dancing to the music of our DNA. Well, that means that then, the murderer is going to murder and the rapist is going to rape, and as well as the painter painting and the scientist doing their science. And, it's just the way the world is. So what kind of objection are you actually making if there is no basis for your claim, right? That there's evil in the world. What if this is just the way things are? So you seem to be, the person who's asking the question seems to think the world shouldn't be like this. And that's a very important point to work through for yourself, is like, well, why do you think it shouldn't be like this? And what should it be like? And that's where you find, especially with the Christian belief system, that there's an explanation of why you're thinking that this shouldn't be this way and how it should be. Now, on that note, so there's a whole bunch of different answers that I could say, like, can God be good, all-knowing, all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, and there still be evil in the world? Yeah, because there's many different reasons for why he might allow it.
Right.
So there's there could be reasons that he has, oh, this is so hard to do in short time frame. There's been arguments about, there could be reasons that God has that we don't know of. It could be that there's, it's sort of a greater good argument. There's arguments that God can't actually, we can think of a possible world in which everybody maybe has free will. They can make real choices, but then they never choose to do wrong. Why didn't God make that world? And then you got Plantinga coming in and saying, yeah, that's probably not a world that God could logically actualize. Okay. Mm-hmm. So there's arguments from like, that's not even logically something he can do if he's going to remain a logical, rational God. He can't just make absurdities happen. So there's a bunch of answers to that. Maybe a starting point for somebody to branch off into these other defenses and theodicies would be maybe Augustine's free will argument that evil is sort of a privation of good. So without the standard of good, how do you know what evil is? You don't even have that. So evil is this lack of good. What God made was good. And then including our choices, our free will. Mm-hmm. And when we choose to do what's not good, you see that's the lack of good. That's where you see all this destruction. And so a lot of different ways to go about. There's some guys that give soul building theodicies, like you need to have fear in order to display courage. You need to have, like all that sort of stuff. Dangers give us virtues. So for me, I tend to lean towards that. I need that standard of good to explain the existence of any kind of evil in the world. And that's sort of where I go.
It's very Lewisian.
Yeah. And there's arguments against it and there's arguments for it. So
no, I think it's a fantastic argument. And I mean, I've heard you speak and say the first thing to do is actually just ask the person their own story, right? Because oftentimes there's personal hurt. That's the real question. And I think most people get that. And then when I say most people, I mean Christians that are trying to make a defense for their faith. Sure. And then I think most people that you talk to get the idea that people are flawed, imperfect, and make choices that hurt other people, and that has a butterfly effect kind of deal. I think where people get mostly caught up, and myself included, I mean, I'm Team Jesus all the way, but this is one of those ones where I kind of, I don't know, is the just seemingly like there is no reason or rationale. And it's just so unjust. Things like stuff with children, right? The abuses of small children, like human trafficking, that kind of thing, or cosmic things like, natural disasters that kill people. It just seems so unfair. It's like, well, no one you can't blame that on Hitler. You know what I mean? Like you can't, he's the great example, right? Well, he's so terrible and all this awful stuff happened because he made bad choices. Right. But you can't do that when it comes to, a tsunami killing a bunch of people. I don't know if you have something that you would tack on if people came back with that kind of thing. I'm curious.
Yeah, there's different responses that I kind of flirt with. One is that when you say there's natural evil, the natural world, I don't describe good and evil characteristics to it because morality implies personhood. You have to have some kind of rationality with it to have moral responsibility. So I don't know that a tsunami hitting an area where the people, where they know that tsunamis are going to hit. I don't know that a tsunami has we call it like a natural evil, but I'm not sure what that means. It's a tsunami. This is the way the world works. So that's one kind of, I think through that and say, well, like my husband and I tease, he's from Oklahoma, and there's a town that's in Oklahoma that the Native Americans knew tornadoes went through there all the time before, it got settled by the Europeans. And they told the Europeans, the white guys, don't settle there. It gets white. That tornadoes go through there all the time. And so there's a lot of human error involved and human greed with building, in places where you shouldn't. And then building substandard structures that are going to get wiped out by these things and where people won't survive. There's a lot of human elements mixed into these.
Because that's true.
But then there's also this idea, I've been playing with this, I haven't formalized it, but the immaterial interacting with the material. So, how does human evil affect the world? The Bible actually says the whole world is like the whole earth is groaning in anticipation of his return. What does that mean? And then we see it in human lives, that if you are an anxious, stressed out, on the edge person, that you can actually suffer a heart attack, which is a physical thing from your immaterial emotions affecting your physical. So there could be an interaction of human evil affecting the physical, and that having some effect on our natural environment.
Yeah.
So I haven't explored that. That's probably controversial. I haven't explored.
Well, that's what we live for.
Yeah.
We're all about controversy.
But there's something there because we know it already happens. So
yeah,
we just had on Sunday Luke 13, which is where Jesus is asked about these Galileans that were killed in the temple, and their blood is mingled with the sacrifices. And Jesus is like, well, repent or the same thing will happen to you. And then he says, no doubt you want to ask me about the Tower of Siloam. And that to me, therefore, I think Jesus is covering the whole range of evils, moral evils, because Pilate's literally killing people in their own temple, and then a tower falling, which is a kind of natural evil. But, it's interesting. You mentioned building like things, maybe the tower was built poorly. Maybe the mason got lazy and he didn't build a proper foundation, which eventually led to 18 people dying. And we're still talking about this tower falling to this day. But, it is somewhat interesting to me that Jesus doesn't it's not to say that we shouldn't strive to give answers, but at the end of the day, Jesus is saying, hey, look, I hate to say this, but it is what it is. And the thing is, every day there is an urgency for you to trust in God, because these things can befall anyone. And the most important thing is your eternal life, ongoing, I guess you would say, not just how you're prospering in this life now. So like, I'm very sympathetic to like the soul building arguments or character building arguments and things like that. I think that's actually, I think it's very intuitive. But those arguments too, we also get to lead to Christ, because we get to say, hey, you want to talk about evil? Let's talk about this Jesus guy and his crucifixion, so God doesn't segregate himself from it, doesn't immunize himself from it. He doesn't vaccinate himself.
Okay. We've taken a turn.
Well, I do think that's an important point to wrap up with. Like, if you really study the book of Job, at the end of the book of Job, which is like almost a Socratic dialogue on the problem of evil, it has this back and forth like you would see in Plato's dialogues. You have God not giving a sufficient, like, here's the answer as to why you suffered. But what I think a lot of people miss is that God is there. He's with Job. And so he's not left us. Like what you're saying, he's present and he's with us and he's for us. And that is, I don't know, maybe we just need to teach this better in the church so that Christians realize what's actually going on in the world, and, that God is present. And we need to do so in a, more substantial manner. Than just saying it like, yay, Jesus rose from the dead and God's for us, but just really unpacking that from our pulpits so that people have more of a substantial philosophical theology on this matter, so that they have some resources for when these great evils befall them and befall our world.
Or just, confidence to be able to talk about it with people. I feel like people are so afraid to talk about their faith because they haven't thought about these things.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip to the other one that you said for you when you were on the hunt for answers. It was about God's existence. Problem of evil was in the mix, but you also talked about the resurrection of Jesus. And I find that this is like it's my go-to, when I talk to people about like, listen, all of this either is true or it isn't, right? And it all comes down to, really, the big question is Jesus who he said he was? Did he die? Did he rise again? Because if he did, then we should pay attention to the rest and figure it out, right? Yeah. But there's no, quote, proof. Now we're having Jay Warner Wallace on in 2 days, so I'm sure he's going to say, well, actually, and his new book is awesome and kind of gets to this without using the Bible, which is really fun. But what is your answer to, because you were searching for an answer to that question about the resurrection? How did you come to the point where you could feel confident about that?
Yeah, that's another big one too. I did first encounter, I believe it was in Lee Strobel's Case for Christ, Gary Habermas. I think that's where I encountered Gary Habermas for the first time, and started looking at the evidence for the resurrection and his work in that, which led me out to Mike Licona as well, my colleague at HBU. But I started to look at how do I know that Jesus rose from the dead? Is there anything that, is evidential, And I started looking into what Gary was saying about these like minimal facts that scholars agree actually happened. Because I would hear things like, Jesus is a legend. He's not a real person. Like I remember a long time ago, the Rational Response Squad actually said that on a show, like, we don't have any evidence that he was ever a person. And I went, wow, really? So I started looking at his minimal facts, and I found out that's just not informed. That most of the scholars they don't have to be Christian. It's, atheists, agnostics, Christians, whoever studies New Testament in this area, they acknowledge that Jesus is a real person, first of all. Like, so the fact that goes with that is that Jesus died. That's a fact of our history, of human history. This person named Jesus died, and he died by Roman crucifixion. And you have that, don't discount the Gospels. These are individual letters. So you have it in all of the Gospels, but you also have it in non-Christian sources that Jesus died, from guys like Josephus, who was he's a Jewish historian, not amiable to Christians. You've got it from Tacitus, the greatest historian for Roman history, right? The greatest Roman historian. You have this mention of Jesus's death, of Jesus being a person as well. So, and then there's more, you can carry this on. But so first of all, I went, okay, so I know that there's a person, Jesus, and that he died. This is historical. Yeah, I'm
right. Well, every person dies. So if he existed, then he died.
I know.
But yeah.
And then so the second one that really resonated with me was that his tomb is empty. There's no other story. It's reported over and over in various, texts like Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho and the Jewish Toledoth, which is a parody of the Christian faith. It's not, again, you got a hostile witness there that, Jesus's tomb is empty. And then you have the testimony of women, which is really fascinating. Like a lot of times when we look at the story, we're looking at it through 21st century eyes. And so we're like, oh, we just passed by that women were giving testimony to the foundational doctrine of Christianity, which is that Jesus rose from the dead, that they are the first ones to testify to it. That's not unimportant in Jewish culture back in that first century. In fact, that woman's testimony is not as powerful, is not as important as I would expect, like Peter to show up and be the first testifier because he's the great hero, or Paul. Well, Paul wasn't a Christian at that point, but that's the kind of like story writing you would expect if you're making something up, if you're mythologizing, if you're making a story up. But we've got this testimony of women, which is embarrassing to have at the start. So we have to stop looking at these like facts through 21st century eyes or 20th century eyes and say, what's the impact of that? So that impressed me, but it was the belief of the disciples and the conversion of James and Paul that I really grappled with. Because the disciples were willing to go to horrific deaths for what they would have known to be a lie. And they didn't gain anything. Like, I hope Jim Warner Wallace brings this up about they didn't get money. They didn't get sex. They didn't get like anything from this. And they went to these horrific deaths, and they were willing to do so. Like they claimed this all the way out. And that really impressed me because I don't know anybody that would go to a gruesome death like that for an absolute lie that they know is a lie because they were there.
Can I pause you for a second? And
Sure.
You can punt this over to Jay Warner Wallace if you want. We keep talking about him. He's gonna be like, I just had a girl ask us at my Bible study last week. She's not a believer yet. And she said, well, how do we know they weren't just brainwashed? Right? Like, sure, they wouldn't go to these awful martyrs' deaths for a lie, but they might go out of true belief, but it could be true belief of something that's not true.
Yeah. How do you know they're not brainwashed? Well, I'm going to have to, I haven't actually considered that. I could sit here and pontificate and come up with some things, or we can bat it around. But I don't know, brainwashing to your death, to a horrific death where you suffer for a long time.
Well, I think she's thinking about like, and again, we can ask Wallace, or we can have you on again. This is my trap that I'm setting.
They did go to death, 25 or so years after the
well, there are still people that were
30.
part of the Heaven's Gate that still believe that the people were taken up in the comet passing. And I mean, there are people that believe some wonky things out there, and they believe them for many years.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I can offer to your the brainwashing comment is that when you look at the stories surrounding Jesus's birth and things like these aren't Jesus's birth, Jesus's ministry on the earth. For example, James, his brother, there's a statement in the Bible that he did not believe Jesus was the Son of God. Like he did not believe that Jesus is the Savior. He actually kind of thinks Jesus is a little crazy. And then after Jesus's death, James goes around as the leader of the church in Jerusalem, which is the most hostile place because they told him to get out of Jerusalem and stop proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah or they'd be put to death. So you've got a problem with the brainwashing theory in that he actually doesn't believe Jesus is the Son of God until after Jesus resurrects. And he's his brother. So
he would have the inside scoop on if he was just
it's not just some great leader brainwashing him from afar or a David Koresh thing or a Jim Jones thing. I mean, you're his brother and you grew up with him and you don't believe in him. So, I mean, that's maybe a counterexample for the brainwashing argument.
Yeah, I'll take it. And then we can discuss it further when you come back, in a few months. We'll talk.
Yeah. And Paul, who would have known Jesus even less, only knew Paul or only knew Jesus.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Relation, but he gave his life to the church, and it's hard to believe he could have been brainwashed.
That's true. That's good.
Yeah,
you guys, we're working this out. I like it.
If we talk long enough, we'll be like, oh, this example, that example.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip over some of the other questions I have just because I know we're coming to the end of our time. We're not there yet, but you alluded to this before, but since you were an atheist, do you think there's a way that atheism can explain the human experience better than Christianity can?
It's a big one. That's straight from my book.
What we do. We finally got you. I'm going to ask you all the big juicy questions.
Yeah. No, so I wrote a whole book on that. I think that comes at the very end. No, I don't. And I think the problem for me, the big ones are the problem of explaining human meaning, value, and purpose, like the meaning to human life and the value of human life, that it has purpose and direction, and that we're here with this oughtness, right? Again, going back to the problem of evil, there's a way things should be, that we have some kind of intentionality to who we are. I don't find a basis for that in atheism. Okay, I'm not just slamming on atheism here. I just don't find a basis for human meaning, the meaning to human life, value of human life, like grounding human rights. When you get to a view like Christianity or even Islam or Judaism, you have that people are, made by God, or in Christianity, made in the image of God, as in Judaism. And so that they have this inherent value. And that's where you get a lot of this idea of human rights and respect for individuals, tolerance, the idea of tolerance. You tolerate ideas you disagree with because that's a human being. And they are created by God and greatly loved by him. If you remove all of that, what is the impetus for the respect of human life? And so that was one of the big ones for me, as far as I don't think atheism and atheistic philosophical framework has yet to come up with something that can substantially provide grounding in those areas.
Yeah. See, you did that in like 2 minutes. I don't know what the problem was.
Do atheists pretend or purport to answer those difficult questions?
I'm sure. Yeah. I haven't been there in a while. I've been over in Islamic epistemology for my PhD, but I would assume that they would base it in more of either a socio-Darwinian evolutionary perspective, a survival of the fittest, something like that. But I actually, for me, when I look at those kind, like a socio-Darwinian perspective, I think it leads to great evils, not great goods. Like, I think you can justify things like racism and genocide and those sorts of things, because, I mean, that's kind of what, we'll give Hitler another shout out, but that's kind of like what he was doing. He was saying that the Aryan race was the most highly evolved, and he was pulling this from Darwinian ideas.
I mean, it's right in the subtitle of the book.
Yeah.
Like Darwin's book, the subtitle has to do with the evolutionary, like, superiority of some races.
Yeah. So that's, and I mean, and for women too, he thought we were lower evolved than of the highest evolved males. So it's just like.
But atheists want to present themselves as, in fact, they're often like liberal, they're often like champions of, the lessers, whatever, the poor, the marginalized, et cetera. So they're all for the weak, kind of in their sort of politics and things, which I guess is a good thing. But that's not consistent with how they see the world. So, I mean, I'm just saying, I haven't heard an atheist really be able to give a good reason for, for meaning or purpose or value either. They just kind of say, well, we all kind of agree on it. And I'll kind of say, well, actually, no, we don't.
Yeah.
And then
as
it's
evident right now with what's going on in the world.
Yeah. So it's like, oh, well, I don't know. It just kind of seems like we quit talking after that. So,
well, and then there's always I shouldn't have to prove a negative, right? Like the burden of proof is on the Christian because the Christian is saying there's something outside of the material world. And anyway, that's when I just send them to people that are smarter than I am to have them give them back.
Well, the other response that I get is that, well, you're asking the wrong questions, because they'll throw back into sort of a Stephen Hawking philosophy is dead kind of thing. And I'm like, well, no, because you have a philosophy of science. You're making a lot of assumptions that, like, for one, that your senses are reporting accurately external reality for you to be able to empirically verify the data and, to get the data from empirical verification. So I'm like, there's a lot of philosophical assumptions going on here. So you can't punt to the, well, philosophies for, ivory tower people. And that's for everybody.
Yeah. I'm going to move away from the stuff of your books. I'm curious, with all the talk today about deconstruction, that word has become a really big buzzword. Because you kind of did some version of this, you constructed and then deconstructed and then came back around, but what are your thoughts on the deconstruction movement sort of that's happening right now inside or outside of the church?
Yeah. So it's a tough one because people are starting to take up sides. And when you do that, the issue, it becomes less nuanced. And that's always a problem, because then we start flatlining people to a viewpoint and reducing their stories to a label. And I don't think that's a good thing to do. But I will say, like, the word deconstruction, if it's language deconstruction that leads to truth deconstruction, that's a problem. So if you're over there in Wittgenstein, yeah. But I think what's happening is most people are seeing it. I've described it recently as like reverse engineering. They're sort of seeing it as picking apart what the commitments that they've made. So do I actually believe Jesus rose from the dead? Why do I say God exists? And then they are seeing what do I believe? What do I actually believe? And they're also kind of saying what parts of what I've been participating in are traditions and cultural to Christianity, but are not actually the gospel, like are not from the Bible, but are cultural, social things that have been put on top of the good news. So I think that's part of what's going on. A lot of deconstruction, I think it's amped up because of these sexual abuse cases coming out one after another in the evangelical church. And that's causing people to question what they're a part of and how that has gone unchecked and how these people do not have accountability. And then again, back to the beginning of the show, why aren't these guys living out what they are professing and basically making a living off of, because they have all these followers and they're paying a tithe? And so there's a lot of ethical questioning going on within the deconstruction movement. And it has a range of people, from people who are walking away, leaving the faith and then trashing everything about the church and evangelicalism, to people more like me who have deconstructed and found God still there, answering all of those big questions. So I still have faith in God, and I still have my doctrines and my belief in God. So you have like this big range.
So you, in the end, we're convinced obviously of God's existence and his goodness in these things. Where did you finally land on the church? Because the church had not been lovely to you, but what do you think about the church now?
I think I need to be less naive about my interaction with sinful human beings, no matter where they are. And I think that was the problem, as I entered into the church with this naive expectation that these believers would actually lead me into this beautiful, flourishing, amazing community of everybody trying to become Christ-like. And yeah, that's pretty naive. I'm the youngest in the family, so I'm an idealist right there. You can see it. And what I need to do where I'm at now is I need to interact with the community, the church community, with more of a understanding of human nature. And that I call it Gandalf. I Gandalf the situation. Like, everybody around me is going to fail me at some point, and that's okay. That's what's going to happen when you surround yourself in community. People are going to fail you. And by the way, I'm going to fail them because I'm human as well. So for my Lord of the Rings fans, I say, well, my relationship with the church is sort of Gandalfing it. I try to do good, even when people aren't doing good to me. So that's the Luke 6, Jesus' teaching. And then for my Star Wars fans, I Obi-Wan it, because Obi-Wan, like the person he loved the most, Anakin, betrayed him and even tried to kill him. So you're going to experience some of these horrific happenings in this life, and even the people you love the most, they will hurt you the most. So Obi-Wan kept doing what he had been taught, kept doing what was good and right and true, and trying to do that. So I Star Wars it as well. So my relationship with the church is like that.
The way you first described it, like I'm going to go into a group of people and they're all going to be great and we're all going to be working for some great cause or something like that. I'm like, well, that's a cult, right? So if
or heaven.
Okay, or heaven, sure. Once we're redeemed. But like if people do promise that, there's probably some horrible failing, like, that's going to come at the end of it. At least our failings, we kind of work out like in bits and pieces. And like, I say this to a married couple. I'm like, it's okay. So we're liturgical Lutherans. So before every service begins, we have a corporate rite of confession, forgiveness. And I say, it's pretty like hard to like be in a fight with your spouse if you're standing next to one another week in and week out, and you're saying, I confess I'm in bondage to sin, and sorry for all my sins, and the pastor says you're forgiven, and like it's kind of hard to like leave that building like still mad at each other, right? So
you're doing couples counseling at church every week. Wow.
Basically, yeah. but my point is that I think there's a value to that sort of rite or liturgical thing every 7 days, so that those of us who are in this imperfect community, at least we're reminded that we are forgiven. We're called to repent of our sins. And so, hopefully we don't have a Jim Jones, on the back end. We have like little skirmishes we work out every week and we get over, and then, it keeps going.
We give you the hypocrisy right up front.
Yeah.
Which feels like it's at least not a bait and a switch.
In small doses.
It's
manageable.
I put that in my book. Like I wish churches would put a little disclaimer in their bulletins that these are just a bunch of human beings and they're going to fail. And, you may experience doubt and anger and disillusionment.
But like what other
or death? No.
What other community or enterprise, doesn't have all those stories? Like every now and then I like to read stories about like, say, how a movie was made. Okay. Like, so The Godfather, like great masterpiece, but like it was a total disaster in the making of it. Everybody hated each other. Like they tried to fire like Francis Ford Coppola like 8 times, and it's totally miserable, and people got ulcers, and and then it's like this masterpiece at the end. You know what I mean? Yeah. But like it's like we all think, wow, it must have all gone really well for them to make this masterpiece. Well, actually, no, they so it's like I don't know. I try not to let people idealize anything or whatever, because I'm like, you're part of enterprises that are the same. I mean, church is like a family,
Yeah, that's good.
That's what I
think. It is a family.
Yeah. I always tell people, and my students at Houston Baptist University, they have to take an apologetics communications class with me. And so I teach them kind of how to build platform and speak and all that. And we discuss imposter syndrome. And I'm like, a Christian who gets up on the stage to tell you some truth of God, or some, give a sermon or give some objective truth, they should have a little element of imposter syndrome in the back of their mind, because they know they can't live up to what they're professing. And so, like now we've come full circle, right? It's not that things that are horribly wrong, like illegal situations, like sexual abuse and all that, shouldn't be corrected in the church. I'm not saying that at all. And people are being traumatized by those situations, and those need to have a substantial response from leaders in the church. But it's also that, you need to go in with a realistic perspective on what engagement with any kind of people are. So whether it's the atheist donut eating society or it's the local Baptist church, you're still going to have all the same human failings in both. And that's a great point that you made, Evan.
All right. I'm going to end us with 2 fun questions, since we've been talking about like, death and hypocrisy and evil. Okay. What's the deal with the red shoes?
Yeah. So Evan's like, I don't know what you're talking about. So on the front of my book, there's obviously it's a girl, and she's walking and she's wearing red hiking boots. So the hiking boots are, because I'm from Oregon, and my love, like if I could do anything, I would go out hiking or riding my bike, something like that. Because I love nature and I love being outdoors. So the hiking is my Northwestern roots. And they also represent the journey of, being, because she's walking in the rain through puddles. So there's a lot of things are convoluted at times and things are messy at times. And then one of the people who read my book said, "Oh, I thought this was like they're red because it's like the Scarlet Letter because you got like, marginalized."
Oh, right.
And all that. I was like, oh yeah, actually that probably had
levels. It works on levels.
I didn't think of that one. And I was like, you know what, that might be sneaky. That might be floating around in the background. Why did we choose red instead of a beige pair of Timberlands or something?
But you have a pair of red shoes. I feel like I've seen a picture of you kicking it around in some.
I have a pair that my husband's such a strong supporter of everything I do that when my book came out, he bought me 2 pairs of red boots. One is the ones that I can wear. And then he had a pair of red Timberlands, like glitterized. So they are completely covered in glitter and usually are in the background when I speak on a show. And we've moved. And so we don't have anything up.
What a guy. Well, that's a perfect segue to my last question, which is tell us a little bit about what you're working on now. I've seen glimpses of this whole like pastor and professor deal. Tell us more about that.
Sure. I've got a couple of irons in the fire. First, the pastor and professor is my husband and I. He's the pastor and I'm the professor. And we have these really intense, like theological and philosophical conversations over like eggs and bacon. And we thought, why are we just keeping this to ourselves? Because we enjoy it so much. And then there's all this like teasing and witty banter back and forth between us all the time, whether there's anybody here or not. And so we were like, well, we need to put this out for people to see. I think it's a good example of a healthy marriage where they're both actively involved with knowing their faith and learning about all the different aspects of their Christian life. So we talk about theology, spiritual formation, apologetics, all of it. We just go into all of it. So it's a Patreon show and people can find it by looking up The Pastor and the Professor.
Cute. So I love it.
That one. And then I have one more project.
Okay.
Real quick. So I've been working with the Savvy Ministries out of Houston.
Oh, yeah.
And we've developed a series of 15 videos that it's now being rebranded to Darkroom Faith, Finding Your Way in the Dark. And this is a collection of videos that we have done based on Gen Z narratives about their struggles in the faith. And we partnered with a world-class film production company, and they are world-class. These are great. These are beautiful videos. And then we have a full curriculum to go with them, and it's free. So be looking for Darkroom Faith. You can look it up. We started out savvyproject.org, and it'll turn to darkroomfaith.org. So look us up.
Okay. Yeah, I knew something about that because there was like an online lecture with, I'm totally spacing on her name, but she's a female apologist and her book has all the circles on the front. Rebecca
McLaughlin. She's one of our writers. Yeah.
Okay. Very cool. Well, I love it all. That's awesome. And then you have books. What's your most recent book? Is it the Red Shoes one?
Why I Still Believe. Yeah. So it's the one that follows my deconstruction story and it follows my reconstruction of the faith and how I couldn't leave God.
Yeah. And if people want to find you and learn more about you, is it Confident Christianity? Is that where they go? Or
I would just send them maryjosharp.com.
maryjosharp.com. Nice and easy. You know what else is easy? HoustonTOT.com. And you guys should all go there to find out about our upcoming events and about who we are and what we're about. And I think really that's all we have time for today. So Mary Jo, thank you so much for being with us. And until we see all of you again, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.